Budget decks are easy! That's a lie. Budget decks can be easy, but just like all skills, it requires practice. It could be easy for me to make a 10-minute video going on about how it's not difficult to build a deck, and all you need to do are these three things, but I want to start this one out grounded. The reality is that there are new people getting into Magic every day, and with that means there are going to be people with less experience than us veterans that decide to make YouTube videos, and there's nothing wrong with that. This is a game meant to be played for fun, and this is true for everyone. Some people may relate to having limited funds and not being able to blow tons of money on all the cool synergy pieces for a deck. This used to disappoint me. After all, it was sad that other people got to play with the cool cards, and I didn't because I couldn't afford it. This led me down to the road of proxying. Now, I'm pretty open about my proxying, and while this isn't a guide to proxy, nor am I trying to convince anyone to, I feel it's still relevant because it's the whole reason I got into budget decks to begin with. I had been playing for several years by this point and felt that if I had unrestricted access to Magic's card pool, it would lead to me possibly including cards that felt like a mismatch for what I was going for. An example would be like adding a Black Lotus in your favorite precon, since you had it in your collection anyways. I was pretty torn up, and it took me a few weeks to finally make the decision, but I ended up pulling the trigger, but made the restriction for myself that I needed to keep it budget. By this time, I'd seen Commander's Quarters content and felt I might be able to make some cool builds myself. I looked into the rules he used and noticed that they weren't always the same, so I decided to pick the ones I found most interesting and went to work. My first decks sucked. I'm not gonna sugarcoat it. They were kinda terrible. I was no longer hard carried by the staples of the format that shore up my weaknesses and my bad deck building. It forced me to actually get good and work with what I had. It took some time, but I eventually got better. It helped that since I played Magic at school and worked at a print shop, I could show up with new upgrades or even whole new decks whenever I wanted. I learned many concepts rapidly, like making sure your deck doesn't hinge on the commander, weighing your color identity since your mana base affects both your budget and your utility land tolerance, and many others. I bring all this up to show everyone, not just where I am, but how I got here in the first place. There were many lost games, and many frustrated hours trying to fix decks. So let's get into the real meat and potatoes. What can $25 really get you? The answer is both a lot and a little at the same time. It would be easy for me to say you can get a ton out of such a slim budget, because with my experience I can. However, the same may not be true for everyone else, which is why it could also be very little at the same time. It took me years to get to where I am today, but I'm hoping with my channel I can shortcut the process for those that don't want to wait as long. I'm not going to use any hard numbers since I feel those are always boring to watch and too concrete anyways, so instead I'll be using estimates. Most of my decks are between the 1 to 3 color range, with most hovering around 2, since I found it widens my card pool enough to build functioning decks without having to allocate too much attention to my mana base. As far as strategies, they for the most part work the same, just on a smaller scale. Certain decks may work differently since they won't have access to the same big haymakers that are traditionally available if your wallet and your children are willing to go hungry. This means that they might pivot into something different. This can mean running less traditional versions, switching to a combo game plan, or just going exponential then winning through sheer critical mass like many decks do. As far as archetypes and strategies go, very few are unplayable since there's so many cards that make things work that usually the options that see less play are cheaper, but still plenty viable. The only time I've really had an issue is when the deck is built around a card that can't fit within the budget like Valakut or Field of the Dead. These are amazing cards, and could carry a deck, but they're a bit too expensive for the restriction. With that being said, what are some of the highest costing cards that have still fit into decks? The crown of this one easily gets handed to Zakama. Now, at first glance, you might assume that it's gotta be something in the deck, since Zakama's literally less than $1. However, at the time that I built the deck, he was pushing over $13, meaning he was over half of the deck's budget. I still built the deck in a way where he got protected with tons of instants and enchantments, and used big mana to control the board and lock it down. Paired with fogs to get me into the later stages of the game, the deck still worked, and I'm really happy I made it, because if I didn't build it, I don't think I'd love fogs nearly as much as I do. Building like this means I'm never guaranteed to be able to use the same template every time, and or just pull from my binders, since it forces me to use new cards that I may not be used to using. But if it fits the strategy, maybe what the deck needs. I want it to be clear that very little changes just because the budget drops. I've had my decks perform at all levels of power, with very little infringement. I've ran strategies from blinking Prison Realm effects to set up a nasty removal engine, all the way to Cascade Tribal hand vomiting out enough power to match the US government. Combo works. Toolbox works. Aggro works. Very little actually changes here, and if you think about it, it kinda makes sense. Wizards has printed so many cards. With each new set, there's a bunch of cards that get overlooked and forgotten about in lieu of better options that impact the best of the best decks. This means there's an influx of good cards that have very low demand with high supply, thus creating a low price, meaning there are tons of perfectly playable options at our disposal, not just trash. As far as some rough numbers, I usually try to keep the commanders under $5. Usually put about $2 to $4 into my mana base and spend the rest wherever I need. I try not to take any super expensive cards, with $2 to $3 usually being the spot where I have to flex something into the budget, with $1 being somewhat difficult if I have too many of. If the deck is super revolvent around a certain card, then I'm willing to go as high as the deck needs for that card, with the cap usually being around $10. But the rest of the deck would need to be really frugal and have a pretty good ability at both finding and making use of that specific card. In total, all of this is kinda meaningless, though, if the deck doesn't have the right ratios, which is why it's important to make sure your deck is still responsible, running plenty of lands, draw, and removal. Got all that? Me neither. I have a Moxfield where you can check out a ton of my decks, and even have some lists I've made for the community for those that may be interested in taking this challenge on themselves. There's plenty of veggies I've collected over the years and have put into neat, sortable lists that are even tagged. That's all available for free for anyone who wants them. I'd recommend, though, if you're gonna use them, you might as well join the Discord, since we're a bunch of fun weirdos in there, and can work together as a hive mind to help with brewing and playtesting. After all, wanna know what's better than one deck builder? 25. If you'll have any ideas for future videos, you can let me know by opening your window and screaming them to me. As always, if you liked the video and you think someone you know may benefit from watching it, consider sharing it with them, so we can all become better deck builders together. This has been Toggo's Rock, and I am out.